Our guest this time is Brad Welsh. He's a director with health insurer NIB, plus the CEO and founder of Mawal. Brad's also the CEO of Energy Resources of Australia and was previously a chief advisor to the CEO of Rio Tinto. Before joining the mining giant, he was a political staffer working for both the New South Wales Premier and in the Prime Minister's office. Brad, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Now, you have had a fascinating career journey. We talked a little bit about it then, but you began as a child protection officer. As we said, you were in politics. You've worked on these major resources projects in the outback, and now you're also in the boardroom. So can you tell us a little bit about that path and what helped to shape your journey?
Yeah, look, I think for me, I've had to reinvent my career probably 3 or 4 times. And every time I've learned something, every time I've always been driven by a really big curiosity about how things work, what makes things kind of move, what makes them stop. And it's been such an incredible journey to work in the highest office in the land, to lead a company, to now be a director on NIB, and then to be embarking on Mawal is, very, very nervous is one way to describe it, but also very ambitious. So
I want to talk a little bit more about some of those roles. We're going into detail on all of them, but you said a moment ago that you've reinvented your career. That's not easy. That's a real challenge. What made you go through those reinventions, and what have you learned about managing, I guess, your own adaptability?
I've always been ambitious and always tried to understand what's the work you need to do to unlock your full potential. And in some cases, it's meant going backwards and kind of into a junior role in order to go forward. In my experience, some windows only open for a certain period of time, and you've got to seize the moment and kind of go through those windows when they open, because they may not be open, in the next month or the next day or the next kind of opportunity. So I've kind of, at the time, it kind of felt like I cobbled together these reinventions. So if I was to say that I kind of planned them and did them in a sequential way, that's probably not true. Like a window opened, I saw the opportunity. I thought it was an opportunity to grow my experience, my delivery, my capability, and went for it.
You've moved across these different sectors, industries, leading companies, advising political leaders. How do you think all those experiences have shaped you as a leader or a manager?
Yeah, it's probably given me a really solid breadth of not just the industry, but the country. I mean, in those reinventions, I lived in Sydney, in Redfern. I grew up. I lived in Parkes in regional New South Wales. I lived in Weipa, which is one of the most remote communities in the country. Gets cut off in the wet season. So I lived there for 10 years. We lived in Perth and Darwin. And so I think it's kind of introduced me to the breadth of Australia as well as the breadth of different industries and different companies. So I'm incredibly thankful that I've had those experiences and they've been able to kind of shape, everything to come together in this offering around Mawal, or this next kind of chapter for me.
You spent a long time in roles with Rio Tinto, and as we said, you were the chief advisor to the CEO on Indigenous affairs. That came in the aftermath of Juukan Gorge. What was it like working with Rio Tinto at that time, especially in that role?
Yeah, it was quite a difficult role, and it was a difficult time for a lot of people in Rio Tinto. I'd worked my way up to becoming an acting general manager of operations, and kind of described myself, and still do, as a senior leader who's Indigenous, not a senior Indigenous leader. And so for me, that was a decision that, I had to kind of think about and say, well, this is a really important issue for the company. It's really important for the communities in which we operate. It's important to our future. And for that reason, kind of jumped into it, at least temporarily for about 12 months. and then kind of went into the ERA role or back into kind of mainstream type of role. I think it was incredibly humbling. I mean, the one Juukan Gorge was more than a cultural heritage incident. It was, for all of the communities that host mining across the country and if not the world, we can't point to one that's wealthy. We can point to communities that have a lot of cash through royalties or, but wealth is a set of behaviors, and wealth is, it's the way you kind of interact, and these communities expected wealth from these projects, and they haven't been able to get it. So I think for me it was kind of an exploration of where we went wrong as an industry. I think Rio and other companies are doing a lot to try and repair that relationship, which will take a long time. But it's also got to come with some recognition that we have an obligation to build capital and risk management and wealth behaviours into host communities so that they can be self-sufficient and they can stand up and they can be enjoying as much as we do this resources boom that Australia's going through.
What do you think Rio learnt through that experience, through the incident, as you called it? And I guess not just Rio, not just the mining sector, but what did Australian companies learn through all that?
Yeah, look, I think for Australian companies, we always know that trust is very difficult and long to build and very easy to break. And that's, that's not a new thing. I think it was, a deep recognition that we expect better. Our communities expect better, and I think the whole nation, and if not the world, had a look and said, look, yeah, okay, we can understand mining is a critical part of Australia's identity. It's lifted the wealth and values of every house in Australia, and so we should be proud of that as a nation. That's something, but we also expect it to lift the wealth and lift the support for the host communities. And I think Juukan was a cultural heritage incident, but it was more than that. It was kind of really finding out that we hadn't been great partners, and that's the whole industry, and we have to do something different so that we unlock a shared future for those communities. And I think, for me, I think the Australian community and the international community expects the mining industry to be better and expects companies to be better. I think they can live with the importance of the mining industry, the wealth that it generates, but you've got to make sure that you're looking after your stakeholders, your constituents, your host communities, and your customers.
On those host communities where these major projects are, you said some of them have a lot of cash through royalties, but none of them have become wealthy. What do you mean by that? And what's the blockage? What's the problem, and how can it be addressed?
Yeah. I think it's a great question. Look, a culture cannot survive unless it manages capital and risk. And, when we think about the Aboriginal community more broadly, the Indigenous community in Australia, the largest kind of contribution is in some way benevolent. It's in some way, it's either government funding or it's benevolent funding, and it's not really expecting the community to manage capital and risk, and for me, the realization, that your cultural identity is central to your ability to manage capital and risk. So your cultural identity comes out of your ability to manage capital and risk. And if we think about kind of what do we expect out of any culture, look at any culture across the planet, look at the Chinese culture. They've managed capital and risk, and it hasn't necessarily been in a Western way. It's been in a uniquely Chinese way. They feel 10 times more Chinese today than they did before they started that journey. And so for me, if we can kind of understand that and help communities win and lose, that's the clear expectation of kind of managing capital and risk. We can move them into an asset ownership space. And so for me, wealth is about a set of behaviors. And obviously cash helps, but it's a set of behaviors. If you think about it, when the first fleet turned up in Australia, they turned up to a wealthy country. They turned up to a country that had really strong work ethic, had really clear rules around cultural identity. And in some respect, the people who arrived here were the poor people. You know, they were the poor people from England who couldn't be fed. They were prisoners. And out of that, we've built an amazing country together. And so I think, you know, for me, if we don't work on those behaviors and teaching modern capital and risk management, then we won't allow communities to realize their full potential. And so that's kind of what wealth means for me.
Let's talk a bit more about that mix of cultures. In Australia, of course, we have Western cultures, systems of governance, and then we also have this ancient, vibrant First Nations culture. Do you think those two cultures, when it comes to corporate governance are meshing together well, and what can they learn from each other?
I think they can. I think they can mesh well. I don't think they have meshed well, if I'm honest. And if you think about, I mean, capital and risk management are global languages. They're not Western languages. They're not Aboriginal languages. They're global languages. You know, we're in the Asian century, and a lot of values in Aboriginal culture align quite strongly with many Asian cultures, like Japan, for example. And so we have an ability to unlock our competitive advantage as a nation by unlocking our shared values, you know, and I think if we could realize our full competitive advantage as a nation, because every nation's trying to find its competitive advantage, we're the ones that straddle Asia and the West. Like we're a Western culture in the middle of Asia, and that should be an incredibly powerful position that we enjoy. You know, like we don't. We're trying to be one or the other. And so for me, I think they can come together. For me, I think, you know, if you can kind of come at it centrally and say that a culture has to manage capital and risk in order to survive, they can do it in their own cultural way, but it doesn't take away that you've got to have capital and risk management in order for your identity to survive.
I want to take a, I guess, very specific look at capital and risk. In 2022, you became the Chief Executive of Energy Resources of Australia, or ERA. Now, for people who aren't familiar with ERA, the company has been rehabilitating a former uranium mine in the Northern Territory. So that is a extraordinarily complex project. What have you learnt doing that work about capital, but especially about risk management?
Yeah, it's an incredible story for the nation. Ranger uranium mine. I mean, it was opened by the Commonwealth in an agreement with the Japanese government at the time to supply uranium. It was done against the wishes of the traditional owners, and we're setting a standard of rehabilitation that would bring that land back to a heritage, or the world listed heritage standard for Kakadu. So it's surrounded by Kakadu, but it's separate from Kakadu. I mean, that's an incredible standard to aspire to. You know, we're refilling pits. We're coming back up to a national park standard, and you know, there's which is incredibly challenging. So it's very hard to estimate. We have 8,000 shareholders on our books that have varying kind of views on the company's performance and the standards. I think for us, it's something that we've been committed to for a long time, and we've been carrying through that commitment. But bringing a former mine site up to one that you would not be able to recognise distinct from the rest of Kakadu, will be an incredible achievement for ERA and an incredible achievement for the team, that have dedicated their careers to doing that. So I'm optimistic that we'll do it. But I learnt an enormous amount as CEO and MD of that business, working with regulators, working with traditional owners, working with shareholders. So for me, I'm much better for that experience. But heavily regulated. I mean, uranium in a national park is always going to be heavily regulated. So probably really thankful for everything that I've been able to pick up in that business.
Being chief executive at ERA, it's a hard job. It's a complex job. What made you say yes when the offer came about?
I think the opportunity to lead such a historic business. I think the complexity was a bit of an attraction as well. you can't unlock your curiosity unless you pick up complex tasks. If you want to pick the easiest task to do, you're probably not going to develop to your full potential as a leader. And so for me, seeing something that was complex, seeing something that could deliver such a strong legacy, building my skills in the listed environment was quite attractive, especially in the real world. So that was probably the real attraction to the role. The opportunity to work with traditional owners and to, work on a legacy asset was also good.
ERA's work isn't just complex, it's also very, I guess, by its nature, long term. It's going to take a long time to do this rehabilitation. What did that teach you about weighing up long term goals and short term goals?
Yeah, I think the longer term the goal, the harder it is to estimate. And so if you've got a long-term aspiration, regardless of whether it's uranium mine, it's very hard to kind of forecast and estimate that goal. So the benefit in having a series of short-term goals to know that you're on the right track is that you can measure, estimate, deliver, record improvements, celebrate wins. So you've got to have the right mix of both. For me, you can't. You can always, if you always talk about the horizon and you never kind of talk about today, you run the risk of kind of losing the team's momentum today. If you only focus on the next couple of or your next couple of stages, then you actually won't hit the long-term goal. So you've got to, for me, you've got to find that balance between kind of long and short term. But you've got to kind of enjoy the, switching between both as well. So yeah, I think it's very difficult though, especially when you're talking long range.
We've been speaking a lot about your executive career, but I also wanted to talk about your board positions. You're now a non-executive director as well. How did your first board position come about, and why did you want to be a director?
Yeah, my first NED role was NIB, which was July 2023. I mean, I'd been MD of ERA before that. I think for me, it was about a broader impact and understanding a different industry and probably a bit more of a reinvention as well. If you think about the health industry, I mean, it's critical to not just First Nations communities, it's critical to the way we see ourselves as Australians. And, understanding private health and understanding kind of private capital is something that was quite an attraction. I mean, the NIB board is amazing and, highly skilled. So some exposure to those directors has been phenomenal for me as well. One real attraction was as we were going through the process, the recruitment process, we talked a lot about being a senior leader who's Indigenous, not a senior Indigenous leader, and that my curiosity was about the performance of the company and where it saw itself. And then part of that might be Indigenous health, but it's actually not the main part. And so my attraction was that I wasn't going to be the director of the Reconciliation Action Program. I was going to be the director of NIB, charged with shareholders' expectations and their ambitions. And so incredibly thankful that I found that opportunity, but also a board and a company that was quite attracted to, I guess, a senior leader who's Indigenous as opposed to a senior Indigenous leader.
You've spoken about that earlier in the discussion. I think I've heard you talk about it again, that the difference between those terms, senior Indigenous leader and a senior leader who's Indigenous. Why is that so important to talk about?
Look, I think it's critical because whether it's in Australia and conscious or unconscious, we have this view that the only way to serve your indigeneity is to work in an Indigenous-facing role. And so our best and brightest talent is gravitating to Indigenous-facing roles, which largely are closing the gap roles, largely are kind of, in some respect, poverty-facing roles. And so you never learn the balance sheet. You never learn the competitive advantage. You never learn what investors are doing. You never learn how to attract capital to your community. So if you want maximum impact as an Indigenous professional, you have to know how to attract capital to your community. You can't just manage NAIDOC week. I mean, we're in NAIDOC week. It's an incredible week, but it's 1 week of the year. Like you need to know how to grow a company's value. And so So for me, being a senior leader who's proudly Indigenous, but I want to manage the balance sheet, not just NAIDOC week. Like that's critical for me because we can bring our full indigeneity all the way through the balance sheet into the core of a business. And as I said a little bit earlier, I think it's part of Australia's competitive advantage. Like we hold and host the world's oldest living culture. And we should be proud of that, but we should actually get balance sheet value out of it. And so for me, that's kind of, we've got to unlock a generation of Indigenous talent that's hungry for the balance sheet role, because otherwise we're going to just fill up the NAIDOC week roles.
This brings me to the work you're now doing with Mawal. What made you start that organization, and what are you trying to accomplish there?
Yeah, Mawal for me brings everything together. So all those career reinventions, everything I've learned in all those different places, I fundamentally believe that we have the talent in the Aboriginal community to occupy more than 7 ASX seats. And so if we don't unlock talent towards genuine balance sheet management, we will never meet any of those procurement targets. We will never meet any of those employment targets. And we will never see indigeneity as being a wealthy culture. And so if I kind of feel like if I don't put the ladder down and unlock that next generation and unlock, communities have talked, even when I was a kid, like my grandparents lived in a tin shack, in Gaduga, and so my family lived in tin shacks. And they talked about owning assets back then. They talked about Aboriginal people kind of owning and, but ownership of assets is very different to consultation. Like you can't consult someone to own an asset. You've got to have a different set of behaviors. You've got to be on risk. You've got to make decisions. You've got to be ready to live with the positives and negatives of those decisions. And so there's a completely different stance our community needs to take if we want to own and operate assets, and they've got to match the commercials. So for me as a commercial leader, and something that I've kind of really focused on growing, is bringing that commercial experience into the community dynamics so that we can unlock a generation of 10,000 Indigenous leaders who are on the balance sheet, but also Aboriginal communities owning and operating assets, which requires a very different behaviour set. So Mawal is kind of hoping to bring all of that together so that we can, normalise indigeneity working all across companies and all across kind of the economy.
And what does success look like for you at Mawal?
Yeah, one leader at a time kind of at the moment. Really scaling out this unlocking Indigenous identity and capital and risk management, and really driving a dialogue to say that we shouldn't be afraid of the commercials. We should embrace them. In some respect, our ancestors and elders have fought incredibly hard to get hard-won rights, some of them in the High Court. We need to activate those rights. They didn't kind of win them so we could put them in a book. Like they won them so that we can activate them. And so for me, it's kind of success is activating really hard-won rights to competitive advantage, but then unlocking a generation of Indigenous people who feel incredibly comfortable as the CFO, the COO, the CEO, the investment, relations manager. Like our kids should be as comfortable in Cape York as they are in New York. That's, we need them to orbit through both. We're not trying to kind of keep them prisoners on their own country. And so, Mawal's success would be that, we've normalised Indigenous excellence on the balance sheet. We've grown competitive advantage in the industry, and we've unlocked a generation of people that we can say, it's now not you're not the unique one. You're the norm. We expect you to achieve.
You were talking about how smart, talented First Nations young people might go into the First Nations sector more broadly. As you said, they might not be going into commercial roles with P&L responsibilities, CFO, COO. Why do you think that is still, and what needs to change?
Yeah, I still think it's this view that the only way to serve your indigeneity is to work in an Indigenous-facing role. So what we're finding is our talent, the best and very brightest of our talent, might even end up in a CFO role, and they feel like they're not being Indigenous while they're in there. They feel like they're being non-Indigenous, so they've got to give back, go back, be back, when there could be nothing more Indigenous than being the CFO and attracting capital and managing risk. I mean, we've done it for 65,000 years. Like the reason we're the longest surviving culture in the world through 2 ice ages and a 1,000-year-long drought is we managed the landscape, we managed the economy, we had a series of rules, and so for me, talent, and from what I've experienced with people, talent doesn't see itself as Indigenous when it's on the balance sheet and then gravitates to or wants to give back or go back or kind of, run to the lowest common denominator to kind of serve their indigeneity. When if you can attract capital to your community and you can attract new ventures and, you're serving your indigeneity well above, working. And don't get me wrong, I support the Indigenous Affairs team, always have. I think they play an important role. It just can't be the extent of experience with Aboriginality so I think this gravitation is still there, and we've got to help people realize that they're reclaiming their ancestry by managing capital and risk as opposed to walking away from it.
Is there a role here for boards and directors at their organizations to help this shift?
Absolutely. Look, one of the most powerful things a board or an executive member or anyone else can do is teach modern capital and risk management to Indigenous talent. And so we talk about mentoring, we talk about kind of, a whole range of things. Indigenous talent with modern capital and risk management is unstoppable. And so we, in our board community and in the executive community, we have the best capital and risk managers in the country. And so we should be using the full effect of that to bring indigeneity through. So to cultivate that ground, to unlock the very best of talent. And, it's one of the things that I'm quite focused on, but, there is no shortage of Indigenous people ready, willing, and able to be developed to get into that, not just the C-suite, but, board roles. But it won't happen if we just hope for it to happen. Like we've got to kind of get in there and teach.
You mentioned earlier the lack of First Nations Australians on the boards of ASX companies. How have you seen that change over the last 5-10 years? And are you hopeful that more change is on the way?
Yeah, look, I think, look, you go back 5 years, maybe, definitely go back 10 years, you couldn't point to one Indigenous director. And so to have, I think it's 7 right now, but, percentage-wise, there's a 1,000% increase or something, So we probably need to see about 50 or 60, genuinely kind of on the ASX. There's about 2,000 positions on the ASX 300. So you probably need about that kind of 50 or 60 Indigenous people making up, various roles. I couldn't put my hand on 50 or 60 people that I could just put into ASX roles, even if I had that power. So we've got to cultivate the talent as well. We've got to kind of, in some respect, we're going to see an improvement over the next 10 years because we're seeing talent come through in new ways, and we're seeing people doing different things. The entrepreneur sector is incredible in terms of its growth. So I think there'll be improvement organically, but we've got to supercharge it. Like we've got to make sure that we're like pulling one director through or one talent through. You're talking 10 to 20% improvement in numbers, right? That's how low the numbers actually are. So changing one person's career pathway is material right now. And so for us, making sure that we're getting the right directors kind of being trained and taught is critical, right? Because those numbers can keep growing, but only if we have a clear and coordinated approach to it.
You talked about the levers that can be pulled. What needs to be done? Is it boards themselves? Is it recruitment agencies? Mentoring?
Yeah, look, I think I'm always a big fan of mentoring in the right purpose and the right way. I think Mawal's doing a leadership program to kind of unlock the talent or to get the talent quite captured and get a cohort of people together. I think we need to grab a cohort of directors and bring them to the very best and brightest Indigenous talent, and we need to build those connections. I mean, one of the things I jokingly said to the NIB board is, I grew up in Redfern, which isn't far from the NIB office, but the pathway to the NIB boardroom was Parkes, Weipa, Perth, Darwin, then to the Boardroom, and so there's like 2 train stations between us, but there's 10,000 kilometers of journey to get there. So so most Aboriginal people will not have an orbit that includes kind of ASX directors in it, and we need to change that.
I want to talk a bit more about your career because you have had this amazing journey. At the moment, there's Mawal, you're still the chief executive at ERA, and you're a director with NIB. How difficult is it balancing all those roles?
It can be difficult. I mean, it kind of surges, it ebbs and flows. So your workload kind of surges and then kind of drops down a little bit. The great thing is I'm passionate about all of them, and I think that when you're passionate about something, you find time for it, you prioritize time for it. So I find it manageable. I find I've got a good team around me. There's some great people that have supported me in my career. If some of my best leaders gave me the clearest feedback about my leadership and about how what I thought I was delivering, I wasn't. And that was incredibly powerful. I didn't want to hear it at the time, but it was incredibly powerful at unlocking my future skill set or my current skill set. And so I think having the courage to have some of those really hard conversations, which is one that we're going to have to do with Mawal, right? We want communities to be successful, but that's going to require some really courageous conversations about changing the way we show up and changing the way we act, and and realizing the benefits of that. But it's not going to be immediate. So for me, it's been kind of a full plate, but a really enjoyable one that you're working on what you love.
A lot of what you've done in your career has been stakeholder management in different forms, whether it's at ERA, Rio, even in politics. Stakeholders are everywhere. What have you learned about stakeholder management? Because it's an important responsibility for boards as well.
I think one of the really important skills is to try to put yourself in the shoes of that stakeholder. And if you can put yourself in the shoes of that stakeholder, to try and understand why is it their perspective is their perspective. So why do they believe what they believe? And, whether they believe what they believe is right or wrong or, logical or illogical, just trying to understand where they're coming from and what they're trying to achieve, even if it's not what they say. For me, that kind of gives you an ability to work with that stakeholder. One of the things I picked up kind of living remotely and kind of moving out of an urban environment was the breadth of views and experience across the country. And while that might sound obvious, like when you're living with a different community that, like in Weipa, we had a barge delivering food. So everyone would kind of quickly build this behavior that you turn up to Woolworths on a Tuesday because that's when the food arrived, and I mean, something in the urban community, you never even think about whether there's going to be apples there or milk's going to be in, and so you learn so much by exposure to somebody else's shoes or exposure to their perspective, that it's much easier to deal with it if you can understand where it's coming from. If you're just kind of battled hardened and trying to get your perspective across, you run the risk of not even understanding where they're coming from, and then you divert significantly from your stakeholders or your shareholders or the people you really care about.
Stakeholder groups aren't homogenous. Within those groups, there's a lot of diversity, whether it's traditional owners like with ERA or even NIB with shareholders. There's going to be many different views, many different opinions, many different wants.
Yeah.
How do you balance all that?
Well, and their views will change.
Yeah.
So even the same stakeholder might have a different view 6 months later than they did. I think in risk management, you have to be prepared to make a decision based on the information you have at the time after reasonable inquiry. And you have to be prepared for the basis of that decision to change. And if the basis is enough to change the decision, you need to change the decision. And so you can't lose the ability to make a decision because indecision is a risk. but you have to kind of find a level of comfort around risk management, and you got the right controls, but you have to live with the decision, and then you have to be ready that stakeholder's view might actually change, or more information might become available, and is that enough to change your decision, or is that enough to change your approach, or have you already invested the capital, or these are all things that you have to kind of balance as a leader, and you don't get them all right. I mean, you've got to manage when you get them wrong, but on balance, you get them right more than you do wrong. And whereas if you characterize that whole period of just indecision, you are certain to get it wrong.
We don't have too much time left, but I wanted to ask a few more questions about your career. You've had this remarkable journey. You've had these reinventions. Is there anything you wish you'd done differently?
Oh, plenty. I mean, I think you learn your biggest lessons out of losses, or when you got something really wrong. Could I have? It's a very difficult question because I learnt so much out of those losses or getting it wrong. I was probably better on the next shot or the next kind of run, and if I would have done it differently, I might not have got the lesson out of the loss. And so it's hard to say that I would have done it differently, but there's plenty of times where I got something wrong and had to repair, retract, kind of come back, and overall move forward. But recognize that I probably would have done it differently going forward. I probably got the classic kind of, we'd have graduates turn up on site, their first real job out of university, and they'd be like, I want to be a GM in 3 years. I want and it's never going to happen. Like you're 10 to 20 years in before you kind of, but I was that person. Like I was the person who wanted to retire at 30, and so you kind of got to help them get through that and kind of help pick them up, so.
You definitely haven't retired at 30. But you were just named the AFR Boss Emerging Director winner for 2025. What did that award mean to you?
Oh, for me, it was amazing. I mean, it was a big surprise. I realized it's the Emerging Director Award, but it was humbling. I was incredibly surprised. I was even in the running, to be honest. I think for me, it was rewarding in that it was recognition of some of the work that I've done and some of the breadth. Hopefully it says to a whole generation of Indigenous kids that you can do it. I mean, I wasn't the smartest kid at school. I was definitely not the smartest in my community or the smartest in my mob. And so hopefully it gives them a sense that there's a pathway if you want to take it. It's hard work, and with some luck, you don't have to go through Parkes, Weipa, Darwin, and Perth, but that it's a pathway that our community can take, and that we can win awards in the mainstream that are genuine, amazing opportunities. So, yeah.
What advice would you have to that next generation of emerging directors, people who want to contribute meaningfully in the boardroom?
An unwavering curiosity. Like, it's something that you cannot replace. You've got to be curious about the company. You've got to be curious about its balance sheet. You've got to be curious about its future, and you've got to share its ambitions, and you can't be the Indigenous director, the climate change director, the AI director. You've got to be a director to grow the value of that company over the short, medium, and long term. And that requires trade-off decisions. It requires judgment. It requires engagement. It requires curiosity. And, you cannot replace curiosity. It can't be done by anyone else. It's only you. And so my one piece of advice is just have this unwavering curiosity to what you want that company to be, or what you think that company is going to be, and just keep chasing it.
Brad, I think that's some great advice. I know you've got a packed schedule, so we might leave things there, but Brad Welsh, thanks very much for talking with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.